Okay, one of the things I want to do is think about how we connect Jesus to the world that we live in. Because no matter how you kind of cut the dice, you mention Jesus to people, people think, oh, a Jesus freak, or, you know, they've just got images in their head of who Jesus is. So we're going to think about that. Let me pray, first of all. Lord, thank you for the food we've eaten. Thank you for the opportunity we have to share together and enable us to overcome all our fears and the concerns that we have and to live for you. Lord, thank you for Chris being here and for the gifts that you're granted to him. Bless his ministry to us and to others as well. Lord, help us now as we think about communicating you to this world that is in so much need of you. In your name, amen. I want to show a video if it's possible. And I'm showing it to you partly for several reasons. One is, I love the music. You'll probably hate it, so that's okay. Just be patient. The other is that it's part of an album that at one point 1 in 10 homes in Britain had. And the reason I want to show it to you is I want you to have a look at it and think, what would I take from that I could use as a connect to communicate the gospel? So we do this quite a bit. I think they're from Manchester actually, or Bolton, or somewhere in darkest Englandshire. The Verve, just, that's some amazing stuff. I mean, one of their more famous songs was The Drugs Don't Work. And when I look at a song like that, and particularly that particular video, what we quite often do in terms of talking to people and discussing with people and training people, so you look at that, what's all the images in there? What are the things that are telling you? What's the things that are true? And what's the things that are absolutely amazing? So life is a bittersweet symphony. Well, that's the experience of many, many people, isn't it? There's a guy who's walking his own way, and yet at the end, what his only solution, this bittersweet symphony, is like, is his mates. That's the guys, the rest of the band who come up. But for me, the most evocative thing in all of that was the line that goes, I never pray, but tonight I'm on my knees. I need to hear some sound that recognizes the pain in me. There are an awful lot of people for whom, if you say to them, can I pray? A friend here was just asking me about someone is dying of cancer, what can they say to them? And I think the simple thing you can say is, would you mind if I prayed for you? Occasionally someone will say, no, don't. But it's pretty rare. And I don't believe in preaching through prayer, but when you do pray, you are communicating something, and you just don't know what's happening. So, let's move on. I'm going to look at some of the big questions that people have in terms of what people say they can't be Christians, they won't even consider Jesus. Keller calls these defeater beliefs. This is a classic one. A lot of people will say things like, isn't there a progression, an inevitable progression from polytheism to monotheism to atheism? Christians are atheists to all gods except one. Atheists just go one God more. The problem with that statement, of course, is that it just presupposes that Jesus is another man-made God. But Jesus is not man-made, and therefore he cannot be unmade by men. People will try that. So we are saying to people, no, we don't just believe in one God. There's not a list of gods, and then we pick and choose, and we've chosen Jesus. We're saying we believe in Jesus, and this is where the theology, if you like, comes in. That's why when you're hearing in church, to me, all theology is evangelistic, and all evangelism is theology. It's no use if it's not, because theology is telling us about God, and the good news is about God. Now, I think the biggest danger, let me ask you, what do you think the biggest danger to the Christian church is today in Scotland?
Apathy.
Apathy, one thing. Anything else? Someone else said? Itself. Yeah, I think that's probably I mean, I do think there will be persecution and stuff come from without. I'm sorry to go back to the referendum thing, but the reason people got so worked up about it is because they thought, wait a minute, this could actually happen. Both ways, people got worked up. When people think, it's nothing going to happen, who cared about the nutty nationalist that lived at the end of the street? Because it was never going to happen. But when suddenly things, whoa, wait a minute, this could happen, then all of a sudden you get all kinds of opposition and arguments and things like that. Well, it's the same with Christianity. People don't mind you going to church. Your neighbours generally, they don't care if you go to church. Like they don't care if you belong to the knitting club or if you're a Trekkie. They just don't care. They do care if it starts making an impact upon their community and life. And I think that the gospel, as the gospel progresses, we will find that there will be persecution from out with. But I do think a bigger danger is heresy within. I find it utterly astonishing how many times I go and do evangelism and outreach in a place, and then I get smacked in the teeth by Christians. But sometimes they don't even deliberately mean it. It's a fatal mistake for me to come into a place and say, there's an email on my phone, I'll have a look at it. I think, you idiot, what'd you do that for? Because generally the devil has a way of getting. But Augustine pointed it in a different way. He saw a great danger from heresy. The heretics themselves also, since they are thought to have the Christian name and sacrament, scriptures and profession, cause great grief in the hearts of the pious, both because many who wish to be Christians are compelled by their dissensions to hesitate, and many evil speakers also find in them matter for blaspheming the Christian name, because they too are at any rate called Christians. I'm not going to become a Christian because I heard this or I had this experience. And it's very, very hard for you to say, well, wait a minute, that's not us. We're not like that. Because that seems incredibly arrogant. So it's really difficult. And I think it's very important that for us as Christians, we retain hold of the gospel, the good news, God's word, and we don't go away from it. When you move away from the word of God, then you really don't have a gospel to proclaim. There are Christians who believe, who would say that the number one reason for not believing is the problem of suffering. I'm not convinced of that at all. I think for some people that is a very real reason in terms of philosophically how they're thinking. For other people it's a very real reason because of what they've experienced. For others it's just really, really bad theology. I don't believe in God because my granny died. Well, what do you think your granny was going to do? Live forever? That's the kind of person who thinks, if there's a God, He's the God who I pray to and I pass my exams and my hamster never dies. You say, well, that God doesn't exist. You're right. I don't believe in that God either. It is suffering, actually, very often will drive people towards God. It's very interesting that it's in well-off, Western, middle-class, liberal circles that people will go, I don't believe in God because of suffering. And in countries in the world where there's a great deal of suffering, there people say, of course I believe in God. I have a friend who was a worker with Christian Witness to Israel, Anna Sutherland. And Anna was in a cafe in Sydney, a Jewish cafe. And she was talking to some of her Jewish friends, young women. And they were going, we don't believe in God because of Auschwitz. We don't believe in God because of Auschwitz. And she said, what do I say? And at the next table, this old lady leaned over and tapped one of them on the shoulder and said, excuse me, she said. And she rolled up her sleeve and showed her Auschwitz tattoo, and she said, I believe in God. Now, that is a kind of example. I found so many people that the problem of pain and suffering is actually a problem that drives them to God, not away from God. Now, for other people, it can be different. I accept that. But if there is no God, there's still pain and suffering. What's the atheist solution to that? And usually it's just suck it up and see. But for the Christian, that's very, very different. However, I found that for me, the larger reason that people give for not believing tend to be the hypocrisies, false teaching, and nonsense that sometimes goes on in the church. U2 had a song on the Joshua Tree called Bullet the Blue Sky, and in the live version of that song, Bono is talking about televangelists, and at one point he says, stealing money from the sick and the old and the poor. Well, the God I believe in isn't short of cash, mister. Sometimes we give that impression. Sow your $1,000 triple favor seed and receive God's unstoppable favor. I'm sorry, that's just blasphemy. It's absolute blasphemy. I went into a meeting in Kirkcaldy. I couldn't believe this. In those days, I was a really bad sinner. I had a ranger scarf on. But I went with a motorbike. I had a motorbike helmet and a ranger scarf and a black leather jacket. And I sat at the back of the meeting. And it was just bizarre because the woman there who was preaching said, "You may have come in here with your ranger scarf and your helmet." I mean, she wouldn't name me, but I was the only one there. And then she said, and the bucket got passed around, and she said, "If you put £10 in, you'll get £100 back." Well, that's a good deal, isn't it? I put nothing in the bucket. And talked to them out. I said, "Why did you presume I wasn't a Christian? Just because I was a Ranger supporter? That's a bit rough, isn't it? You're Celtic, I was more appalled at the theology and the practice of it and how people see that. When I lived in Livingston, the only time I was visited from the church, and I mean this literally, the only time I was visited was when they were collecting money for the church roof. And it's such a cliche, but nobody came to tell me about Jesus. But they came to ask if I'd like to contribute towards the church roof. Now you can go the opposite way. I remember in Brora one time, I said, there was a woman who came along and she was very grateful for some stuff that we'd done, and she came along with quite a substantial check. And during the course of the sermon, I said, "We're not after your money. If you're not a believer, we don't want your money." So she ripped up the check. My deacons were kicking me afterwards. But that's true. We're not looking for that. We have to recognize the fact that some people use religion to exploit other people is clear. Bono again. Let's give the blessed Saint Bono. I go to America and I turn on my television set and I start sweating profusely because these guys have turned faith into an industry. It's appalling. It's ugly. The guy's hand is virtually coming out of the television set. Now, if you want, you could look at Bono and say, "You hypocrite, you make money out of singing about injustice." You can argue that if you want. I think it's a bit unfair on him. And it's true that neither you or I are in a position to judge in some sense, because we don't know what he's done with the money. What do we do? But I think that's a great advantage of being a Christian, because we leave God to do the ultimate judging. Nonetheless, when we see something that's wrong, we have to dissociate ourselves from it. We should point out to people it's always wrong to tar everyone with the same brush. There are Christian preachers who use the medium of TV well and do so with honesty. But I have to say that overall, as a medium, it doesn't really lend itself to the Christian message and is ripe for exploitation. I think I would also point out that it's not just religious people who exploit people for money. Just go to a motorway cafe service area and you'll see what I mean. Go to a hotel and tell them you're there for a wedding and they double their prices automatically. Everyone, that exploitation, we move away from it. And atheists do the same. I have to tell you a story about Christopher Hitchens. There's this church in London phoned me up and they said, "David, would you be willing to debate Hitchens?" I said, "Oh, that would be my dream. Hitchens or Dawkins, I'd love that." They said, "Well, we've asked Hitchens and he's agreed." And I said, "Great." And they said, "Could you come and do it? How much would you charge?" I said, "Charge?" I said, "Just give me a rail ticket from Dundee and a bottle of Iron Brew and I'm happy." Or malt. And I put that in because I'm contextual, because there are some of you who will hate the idea of malt and some of you hate the idea of Iron Brew, but I reckon between the two I'll get all of it. But you know what Hitchens asked for? 2 first-class return air tickets from New York. $50,000. When the church pointed out that they were a church, they didn't have those kind of resources. His agent agreed to cut the charge because it was a charity to $25,000. The church said that was way beyond their means. You know what the agent told them? He said, "Well, there's churches in America pay that kind of money." I'm thinking, you complete fools. You pay an atheist $25,000 to come and mock God in your church with the Lord's money. Are you kidding? Give him his expenses. But it was just crazy. So I think, but we have to be careful though. I think we have to be very aware that there are difficulties and problems in the church. And even in our own fellowships, I always say to people, there was a guy who came once and he said, "Dave, tell me about your church." And I said to him, we're a bunch of screwed up people in a screwed up world with a great Saviour. And he just looked at me and said, I'm in. And started coming. Don't pretend in your church to be what you're not. Because see, when you do the kind of kumbaya thing, you all hold hands and you all say how much you love one another. And then they come to your house and they hear you moaning away about another Christian that you just held hands with and told them how much you love them. They're just going to look and go, they don't believe any of this. So, we recognise the problems. Another one that I hear a lot is, wasn't Hitler a Christian? And I find this one amazing. This one gets brought. There's this kind of law, Godwin's law, that the first person to bring up in an internet conversation, especially, and don't do them, will bring up Hitler. But I'm amazed at how many people who don't know come up with Hitler was a Christian. Now, if you're asking if Hitler was a follower of Jesus Christ, the answer is no. If you mean, was he baptized as a Roman Catholic? Did he sometimes make positive references to Christianity in his public speeches? And did he try to get the churches on his side? Yes, absolutely. But he was not a Christian in any meaningful sense of the word. He didn't read the Bible, he didn't go to church, he didn't follow Jesus because he hated Jews. And Jesus is like the ultimate Jew. It's difficult to see how someone who hated the Jews could follow the greatest Jew of all. Martin Bormann puts it this way: National Socialism and Christianity are irreconcilable. National Socialism is based on scientific foundations. National Socialism, and he's talking about, contrary to Christian, on the other hand, must always, if it is to fill its job in the future, be organised according to the latest knowledge of scientific research. The concepts of Christianity and their essential points have been taken over from Jewry. Now, you don't get into the was Hitler a Christian, wasn't Hitler a Christian argument in one sense. But you will often get people say, well, these people claim to be Christians. And you say, well, no, they weren't. And they say, well, how can you say that? You say, well, what is a Christian? And take the opportunity to actually discuss what is a Christian, what is a real Christian. Also, one of the dangers because of the internet is that people will have quotes all the time and you think, oh wow, that quote proves it. So for example, I get given this one quite a bit because it goes around on the internet. People tend to look at things that they want to, that suit their beliefs. So they don't really read things in context. The idea of reading a whole book is quite foreign to a lot of people. So they just look for quotes. They quote mine. And this is one of the ones that was used. Actually, it was used by some people from here when we were talking about the school situation. Not this particular church, but this area. Hitler said, secular schools can never be tolerated because such schools have no religious instruction. See that? Hitler was wanting Christian schools. That's it, proves it, doesn't it? Except you've always got to look at context. That's true of everything. What was the context? That quote is from April the 26th, 1933. It was a speech before Hitler was in full power, during negotiations leading to the Nazi Vatican Concordat. In other words, he was negotiating with the Catholic Church at the time. It was a speech that was given to a Catholic Teachers' League. It doesn't take a genius to work out why Hitler would speak in favour of Catholic schools, because the vast majority of schools, nearly all schools in Germany, were either Catholic or Lutheran in front of Catholics when he was still in a position of trying to consolidate his power. Once you know the particular cultural and historical context of the quote, it changes it considerably. And I'm just giving that as an example of how not to use things. Sometimes you'll come across a quote and you'll say, oh, I'm going to use this for Christianity. Like, I hear quite a few from Einstein. Einstein wasn't a Christian. He said some really interesting things that you can use, but don't pretend that Einstein was a Christian. We have to be honest. Here's another one I come across a lot. Doesn't religion restrict freedom? That's Hitchens again. The urge to ban and censor books, silence dissenters, condemn outsiders, invade the private sphere, and invoke an exclusive salvation is the very essence of totalitarianism. Now, what do we say to that? Religion does very often restrict freedom, but we have to be really careful about tarring everyone with the same brush. It's clearly demonstrable that anti-religion can also restrict freedom. I mean, what if we let Alistair Noble or Jonathan, who's here, loose in schools? They're creationists. We need to stop it. We need to ban it. Why Why have certain hotels now removing the Gideon's Bible? I mean, what harm is a Bible doing in a drawer in a hotel? You can't have that. By definition, of course, every healthy society must exercise some kind of restriction. You wouldn't want to live in a society where everything could be published. The minute you say that child pornography should not be published, which I hope you would, then you have breached the principle of absolute freedom of speech. Every society is going to have some kind of restriction. The only question is where you draw the line. And this is what I would argue, and I'd really be prepared to argue this, that I think in a society where Christian teaching pervades the whole society, you get a far more freer and more tolerant society. Once you remove that, you will get a much more intolerant society. Because what do they replace God with? They tend to replace God with the state. And the state's a really bad God. You know, the church is a really bad runner of the state, but the state is a really, really bad God. You know, look at these guys. Have these totalitarian states in the 20th century, were they Christian? I'm trying to think of any totalitarian state that could be called Christian in any sense whatsoever. But I can think of plenty that were atheist. I can think of plenty that are religious. And that's the other thing, of course, that is used because people will say, well, all religions are the same, and you have to deal with that. Hitler may have not been a card-carrying atheist. I don't think he was a card-carrying atheist, but I think he was certainly not a Christian. But Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot certainly were. I find Stalin really, really interesting because I was reading a biography of him, not by a Christian, and there was this fascinating page where, as a 14-year-old boy, he came across Darwin's Origin of the Species. And after staying up all night reading it, he was so excited by it, he became an atheist. This is what he said. He ran to his friends and he says, God's not unjust. He doesn't actually exist. We've been deceived. If God existed, he'd have made the world more just. And when his friend said, how do you know that? He said, read this, and gave him a copy of Darwin. Now imagine that. Beware of Darwin, reading Darwin. It leads to Stalinism. That's not true. But in Stalin's case, it was absolutely true. It was not just a simple atheism on his part either, but a bitter anti-theism. He went to visit an old church with a friend who was the son of a priest. And Stalin said to him, pull down the icon and urinate on it. Smash it. You're not afraid of God. Good for you. Now, what's interesting in that is people, my atheist friends, they'll say things like, look, Stalin was an atheist, so what? He didn't do what he did because he was an atheist. They'll say, he also had a moustache. You don't blame everyone who has a moustache for Stalinism. Now, that's a very facetious argument. It sounds quite good, but the simple answer to it is very simple. If Stalin had attacked barbers and burned down barber shops, you could say, okay, that's quite relevant that he had a moustache. You know, he wasn't very keen on people who cut moustaches off. However, he didn't do that. But he destroyed churches, he banned Christianity from public education, and he sent thousands of Christians to their death, not because he had a moustache, but because he hated Christianity. Also, there's another side to that as well. And I think this is missing the main point for Stalin and others. Stalin did not believe in an afterlife. Neither did Hitler. In the film Das Untergang, Downfall, Hitler is portrayed as a normal human being who likes dogs, was a vegetarian, was kind to women, which is all true. And after the Holocaust and everything that he's done to Germany, after Berlin has been destroyed around him, the film shows him in the bunker talking about death, getting ready to commit suicide, and he said, finally, I will be at peace. Why? Because he didn't believe there was an afterlife. If you don't accept that there's a day of judgment,